I told my husband, "I've been fired," to watch his response. But a shocking whisper made me freeze. On the morning of May 22nd, the day felt almost suspiciously bright, like the sky itself wanted to warn Zenaia Adia that nothing in her life would stay the same. At 38, she often moved through her days on autopilot. Home, work, home again, like a scratched record stuck on the same loop. She had started to believe that all the big milestones were behind her and that the rest of her life would be a slow glide toward retirement. Her mother always said, "Life really starts after 40. And lately Zenaia wasn't sure whether that was a promise or a joke. She pulled her old Nissan Altima into the staff parking lot outside the Carver Building Business Center, grateful that at least the car still cooperated despite her husband Killian's constant nagging to trade it for something flashier. With the two of them barely keeping up with the mortgage on their 3-bedroom condo in Southside Atlanta, the idea of another loan felt more like a nightmare than a goal. Inside the building, the morning bustle greeted her. Mr. Curtis, the elderly security guard and retired military man, sipped coffee and waved his paper at her, talking excitedly about last night's Falcons game, a game she pretended to remember to keep the conversation easy. He joked about his wife filling their cellar with canned food, in case the world ends again like '08, and Zenaia nodded, thinking of the jars of peaches and cucumbers she and Killian stored every year at the family land, a habit inherited from people who never quite forgot hard times. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Upstairs, the marketing department already buzzed like a busy beehive. The printer rattled, the coffee maker hissed, phones rang non-stop, and co-workers chatted about TV shows and old-school recipes. Someone talked about chow chow and cabbage, another about canning tomatoes, while a younger colleague begged for the recipe to impress her boyfriend. Zenaia hung up her jacket in her small glass-walled office, a modest but hard-earned privilege of being a senior manager, and glanced at the framed photo of herself and Killian on vacation at Hilton Head 3 years earlier. That had been their last real trip before the mortgage swallowed their spare money and extra shifts became their new normal. She spread out documents on her desk, turned on her computer and kettle, and began fixing the final figures for a major retail client's quarterly campaign report. Her manicured fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. Numbers and charts were her comfort zone. The calm didn't last long. Amari Dixon, her colleague and office friend, appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, grinning as he called her Busy Bee, and guessed that she'd been up late working. He knew her order without asking: cinnamon cappuccino, light foam, and teased that after years of working side by side he knew all her weaknesses. They chatted briefly about projects until Sable, the young secretary with neon pink nails and a matching blouse, burst in with news. Mr. Davenport, the CEO, wanted to see her. "Urgent," Sable announced. Instantly, old fear rose in Zenaia's chest. Even after 8 years at Alpha Market, being summoned by the head of the company made her palms sweat. She smoothed her pencil skirt, adjusted her beige blouse, and tried to breathe as she crossed the elegant reception area with leather sofas, abstract paintings, and tropical plants, all designed to remind everyone exactly who held the power here. Inside the CEO's office, Mr. Sterling Davenport looked up from his screen and motioned for her to sit, his sharp gaze making her feel transparent. She braced herself for criticism or bad news. Instead, after a short, nerve-stretching pause, he told her the board had decided to offer her the position of head of marketing. For a moment she could only stare at him as if she'd misheard, her mind roaring with images of waves smashing against the Hilton Head pier. He explained that her campaigns had outperformed all others, that her department respected her, and that the company needed a steady but innovative leader. When he slid the draft order across the desk, the salary line nearly made her dizzy. 40% more pay, bonuses, a company car, and her own parking space. With that, she could cover the mortgage comfortably, start saving, maybe even revisit the dream of a second child that she and Killian had shelved until money got better. Trembling but resolute, she signed the papers and walked out of his office with the promotion clutched in her hand like fragile glass, stunned that only hours earlier she had been worrying about making the next payment on time. Back at her office, Amari popped his head in again with another joke and another coffee, expecting to see her grim after a budget scolding. Instead, he found her dazed, trying to decide whether to scream with joy or burst into tears. She wanted to tell someone, but fear of gossip and jealousy made her bite back on the news. Some colleagues would congratulate her, others might sharpen knives behind polite smiles, and she had no idea whether Amari himself might have hoped for the same role. So she only hinted that she had something to celebrate, and suggested they go to the diner after work, promising to explain then. He pouted dramatically, claiming he wouldn't be able to concentrate all day with such a mystery hanging in the air, and she laughed, grateful for the momentary distraction. But as soon as he left, old memories flooded in. 12 years with Killian, the whirlwind courtship, the quick wedding half a year after they met. Her grandmother, Mama Era, had been the only one skeptical from the start, warning that young men could be charming for all the wrong reasons. Back then Zenia had dismissed it as bitterness from a woman whose own husband had left her for someone younger. Looking back, she wondered if deep down she had avoided introducing Killian to her grandmother in order not to hear the truth too clearly. Her phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Killian. His voice sounded tense as he asked if she would be home late, claiming he had news and needed to talk. She instinctively reached for her own good news, the promotion that could ease their money worries, but then a mischievous idea flashed in her mind. What if she pretended she'd been fired, just for a moment, to see his genuine reaction, to test whether he cared about her or just her paycheck? Her voice trembled on purpose as she told him something important had happened at work. Immediately, Killian jumped to the conclusion she'd lost her job. Instead of offering comfort or reassurance, he snapped. He cut her off, cursed about the project she'd taken, and called her an idiot before quickly apologizing and blaming stress and a meeting for his outburst. The insult hit her like a slap. In 12 years of quarrels and disagreements, he had never crossed that line. The joke curdled on her tongue. When he abruptly ended the call, she put the phone down in slow motion, feeling a knot form in her chest. She tried to refocus on her report, but the word idiot echoed in her head, dragging up memories of his recent behavior. Late nights, expensive smells of cigars and cognac on his clothes, vague explanations about clients and negotiations. The next call brought comfort. Her grandmother's warm, slightly raspy voice filled with pride when she heard about the promotion. Mama insisted that they should celebrate with apple pie and raspberry compote, scolding her granddaughter for putting work before family. When Zenia mentioned the failed fired joke and Killian's harsh reaction, suspicion crept into Mama's tone. A husband should offer support, not anger, when you're in trouble, she reminded her. Even so, the old woman's main concern was to see her granddaughter soon. She had never met Killian in person despite 12 years of marriage, only in photographs. After hanging up, guilt and unease tangled together in Zenia's chest. She tried to call Killian back, but his phone was suddenly unavailable, which made his earlier claim about being in a meeting sound even more doubtful. Anxiety gnawed at her until she finally gave up on working efficiently. When Amari checked on her, he immediately noticed the strain on her face. She admitted in vague terms that something at home felt wrong and asked him to finish the tables for the retail account because she couldn't concentrate. He was clearly worried and gently suggested that woman's intuition rarely lied. At that, she decided to leave early and talk to Killian face to face. Mr. Davenport, still in a generous mood after the promotion, readily agreed to let her go, reminding her only to prepare a strong presentation by Monday. The afternoon heat wrapped around her as she stepped outside. On the drive home, she kept calling Killian with no success. By the time she reached their building, her nerves were stretched thin. In the elevator, she ran into their neighbor, Miss Beatrice, the building's unofficial bulletin board, who launched into a story about another couple's drama on a different floor. Casually, she mentioned seeing Killian around noon, leaving the building in the middle of the workday. That small piece of information lodged in Zenia's mind like a thorn. He had told her he was in a meeting. So why had he been home? Quietly, she unlocked their door and stepped inside. Light spilled from the hallway, but the apartment seemed empty at first. Then she heard voices, her husband's and a young woman's, coming from the kitchen. Her stomach dropped as she tiptoed closer, heart pounding. The woman asked if his wife suspected anything. Killian laughed and called his wife, that idiot, who believed everything he said for 12 years. They joked about how long he'd played the devoted husband and shifted quickly to discussing her grandmother's brownstone in the West End. A spacious, valuable property with high ceilings and old-world character that he clearly saw as a gold mine. He laid out how he'd worked with a lawyer on the will, how, as Zanaya's husband, he'd be entitled to half once the property passed to her, and how his friend at a nursing facility could get Mama admitted for rehabilitation, where, as he put it, old people died like flies and nobody asked questions. The woman laughed, calling him a monster half-jokingly, and he shrugged off the moral weight, insisting that financial pressure justified everything. If the plan with the grandmother didn't work, he said, he'd settle for divorce and half the current condo, though he clearly saw it as second best. Listening from the hallway, Zanaya felt the world tilt under her feet. She remembered times he discouraged visits to her grandmother, brushed off her attempts to stay close, and volunteered to take medication to the older woman after a health scare. Now, the pattern looked sinister. When the young woman prepared to leave, worried she might run into the wife who'd claimed she'd been fired, Killian referred to his spouse as a cow who couldn't even hold on to a job and complained about the financial mess he'd be in without her income. His contempt and cruelty stripped away any remaining illusions. Before they reached the hallway, Zanaya slipped silently out the front door, stumbling down one flight of stairs and out into the daylight, gasping for air, feeling as though 12 entire years of her life had just been declared counterfeit. Sitting alone in her car in the parking lot, the noise of children playing nearby and neighbors chatting felt unreal, like background sound in someone else's life. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone to call. She imagined her mother's "I warned you" speech and realized that after years of throwing herself into work and marriage, she had let most of her friendships fade. The only name that felt safe to press was Amari's. When he answered, his voice startled her by sounding exactly as he always did. Calm, friendly, slightly teasing. As soon as he heard the shake in her voice, though, he grew serious. She asked if they could meet right away at a small diner near the business district, and he agreed without hesitation, promising to arrive in half an hour. On the way there, she caught sight of a blonde woman in a short dress leaving her building and getting into a red Volkswagen, with Killian standing in the entrance like a gentleman seeing her off. Instinctively, Zanaya ducked in her seat and drove away, heart pounding. The diner, with its checkered tablecloths and old-fashioned decor, had always felt cozy and harmless, but that evening it served as the backdrop to the collapse of her old life. She chose a corner booth and ordered tea, hoping the simple warmth would steady her shaking hands. When Amari arrived, his expression shifted at once from playful to worried as he saw her face. He reached for her hand across the table and told her to start from the beginning, promising to listen to anything she needed to say. The story poured out in disjointed fragments. The promotion, the ill-conceived joke about being fired, Killian calling her an idiot, the overheard conversation about the brownstone and the nursing home. The more she spoke, the more the heavy pressure inside her loosened, replaced by a hollow ache. Amari tried at first to suggest other interpretations, asking if she might have misheard or misunderstood, but she repeated the exact words. That idiot believes everything I tell her. Old people die like flies, and he went quiet. She whispered that she feared Killian might already have tried something with her grandmother, remembering how he had delivered medication during the previous, almost stroke. Amari didn't call her paranoid. Instead, he suggested that if they suspected danger, the first place they needed to go was her grandmother's apartment. They drove across the city in thick evening traffic, every red light stretching out her anxiety. She tried calling Mama's flip phone, knowing the old woman's habit of answering every call, but it rang unanswered again and again. Each silence felt like another confirmation that something terrible had happened. Amari tried to comfort her, reminding her that shocks made people freeze and that she should not blame herself for stopping by the diner first. She had been in too much shock to think clearly. They cut through side streets to avoid congestion, and along the way she learned that Amari had actually grown up near her grandmother's neighborhood. It struck her that she had worked beside him for years without asking many questions about his private life, while he had quietly noticed and understood more about hers than she realized. When they finally reached the old brownstone, with its carved facade and solid presence, she ran up the familiar stairs to the 4th floor. The bronze number 54 gleamed on the apartment door just as in her childhood. She rang, then knocked, then called out, But there was no answer. A neighbor opened her own door, complaining that there was no point pounding since nobody was home. She calmly informed Zenaya that paramedics had come earlier with a stretcher and taken her grandmother to the hospital, mentioning that the old woman had seemed conscious and had waved at the neighbors as she left. The neighbor also casually described a distinguished man in a suit, who had visited in the afternoon and introduced himself as Era's granddaughter's husband. The timeline matched perfectly with what they already feared. To the neighbor, it was just a curious detail. To Zenaya, it felt like confirmation that Killian had set his plan in motion. After a brief, polite exchange, she and Amari hurried back to the car, adrenaline buzzing under her skin. She felt caught between wanting to scream and wanting to collapse. They called the hospital's emergency department, and after some back and forth, they got confirmation that her grandmother had been admitted with a suspected stroke and was in stable but guarded condition. While Amari tried to rationalize that health crises were common at 83, Zenaya kept returning to the exact words she'd overheard Killian say that afternoon, the way he'd mentioned his friend at a nursing home, the way he'd talked about old people dying like flies. The immediate question became what to do next. Going straight to the police with only overheard fragments and suspicion felt risky. She imagined officers rolling their eyes at a story about a greedy husband and a grandmother's condo. Amari suggested that if anything had been tampered with, the hospital might find traces in her blood, but she doubted anyone would think to test an elderly woman for toxins without a push. That thought hardened her resolve. They decided she had to go to the hospital in person and demand that someone listen. When they reached Grady Memorial, visiting hours were over and the triage nurse, exhausted and impatient, tried to send her away until morning. But desperation stripped Zenaya of her usual hesitation. Lowering her voice, she explained that she had reason to believe her grandmother had been deliberately harmed and insisted on seeing a doctor. That claim caught enough attention that the on-call physician, Dr. Evelyn Stone, came out to speak with her. The doctor listened carefully as Zenaya outlined the sequence of events. The afternoon visitor, the sudden illness, the overheard plan involving a nursing home, and the family property. With some reluctance, but obviously intrigued, Dr. Stone agreed to order additional toxicology tests and allowed a short visit, warning that her grandmother had been agitated and sedated upon admission. Inside the intensive care unit, the sight of Mama lying pale and small among tubes and monitors nearly broke her. The old woman's eyes fluttered open when she heard her name, and recognition softened her lined face. In a strained voice, she told her granddaughter what had happened. Killian had arrived with tea, saying it was from Zenaya, insisting that she drink it while it was hot. Shortly after, the room had begun spinning. Her heart felt like it might burst, and she had collapsed. She confessed that she had overheard him speaking on the phone, using the exact same chilling phrase about old people dying fast in certain facilities. She was certain he had wanted her out of the way. Hearing her grandmother confirm their fears turned Zenaya's shock into focused anger. She promised that she would not let him get away with it, that she would protect her and make sure the truth came out. Mama, even in her weakened state, warned her granddaughter not to act recklessly, reminding her that dangerous people did desperate things when cornered. Dr. Stone appeared in the doorway, gently ending the visit and promising to keep a close eye on Era's condition. As Zenaya left, she felt the world rearranging itself around a new truth. Her husband was not just unfaithful and opportunistic. He was capable of harming the only elder who had ever stood firmly on her side. After leaving the hospital, the next stop was the police station. With Amari by her side, she filed a report, laying out the overheard conversation, the suspicious circumstances, and her grandmother's account. The officers took her statement and noted that they would wait for the hospital's test results before deciding on further action. It wasn't the immediate justice she secretly hoped for, but it was a start, a paper trail, a formal record that Killian's name was now tied to a possible crime. By the time they stepped back into the night air, it was well past midnight. Exhaustion pressed down on her, yet beneath it ran a wire of determination. Amari offered her a place to stay at his apartment right away, but she shook her head. There were too many essential things at the condo: documents, her work laptop, personal items, and she knew that if she didn't confront Killian now, she might never feel fully in control again. She insisted on going back just once, with Amari waiting outside as backup. When they pulled up to the building, the light in their fifth-floor apartment was on. Her heart hammered as she stepped out of the car, while Amari reminded her of the 30-minute limit they had agreed on before he called the police. The elevator gave her a glimpse of her own pale, drawn reflection. Hair messy, eyes swollen from tears and lack of sleep, yet something new glimmered beneath the exhaustion, a hard spark of resolve. Before she could use her key, the door opened. Killian stood there, clean-shaven and freshly dressed, as if he'd been waiting for a casual evening rather than a confrontation about attempted murder. He demanded to know where she had been, complaining that he'd tried calling and claiming her phone had been off. She stepped past him into the living room without answering, the familiar furniture suddenly looking like props on a stage rather than pieces of her life. Calmly, she told him she hadn't been fired at all, that she had been promoted to head of marketing with a significant pay raise and had only pretended to lose her job as a joke to see how he would react. Instead of sharing in her joy, he scolded her for the joke and tried to brush off his earlier reaction as stress. She pointed out that he hadn't even bothered to follow up after hearing his wife might be unemployed, didn't ask questions, and seemed more annoyed than worried. Then, without raising her voice, she mentioned the hospital. She told him she knew he had gone to her grandmother's apartment, that after his visit Era had been rushed to the emergency room, and that the older woman had heard him talking about sending her away to a place where the elderly didn't last long. She described overhearing every word he had said in their own kitchen about the condo, the will, and the nursing home plan. At first, he tried to deny everything, calling the accusations insane, and suggesting that her grandmother was confused because of her age. But when she added that the hospital had been asked to run tests and that the police already had a report, his expression shifted. The mask of hurt indignation cracked, revealing cold calculation. He muttered that it had been the idea of his lover Veronica, and tried to minimize his own role. She didn't let him. She reminded him that he had been the one carrying the tea. Whatever the plan, he had acted on it. To destabilize him further, she pulled out her phone and claimed she had been recording their conversation from the start, implying that his half-confession was now saved. That bluff was enough to make him pale. While he sat there stunned, she went to their bedroom, pulled out a small suitcase, and began packing swiftly but methodically. She took documents, a few sets of clothes, her laptop, small valuables, and a few framed photos of her parents and grandmother that held real emotional weight. From the wall, she removed their wedding photograph, slid it out of its frame, and tore it cleanly in half, letting the pieces fall apart in her hands. Confused and suddenly desperate, Killian demanded to know what she was doing. Without drama, she told him she was leaving and that they would handle the rest. Divorce, sale of the condo, division of proceeds, through the courts. She made it clear that she didn't care about squeezing every penny out of the property. She only cared about cutting ties with him and protecting her grandmother. She promised that if he went anywhere near Era again, she would make sure he regretted it in ways that had nothing to do with money. He tried to change tactics, shifting from anger to pleading, reminding her of their 12 years together, insisting that they had been fine, as if her ignorance of his motives had been proof of marital success. She corrected him quietly, saying that maybe he had been fine, benefiting from her trust and income, but she had not. Then, in a twist even though she hadn't seen it coming, she said that in a strange way she was grateful. His actions had ripped away the illusion she'd been living under and forced her to see the truth. She reminded him that he had called her an idiot, but the real foolishness would have been staying blind. With that, she swung the suitcase handle into her grip, told him that starting now he could manage the mortgage on his own since she was unemployed, just like he had wanted, and walked out, closing the door with a quiet finality that felt louder than any slam. Downstairs, Amari was waiting anxiously. When he saw the suitcase, he took it without a word and placed it in the trunk, then asked gently if she was all right. For the first time that day, she realized she could answer honestly that in a strange, fragile way, yes, she was. Exhausted, heartbroken, but also free in a way she hadn't felt since before the whirlwind wedding 12 years earlier. As they drove away from the condo, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, each glowing window a small reminder that countless other lives were unfolding simultaneously, some beginning, some ending, some quietly reshaping themselves as hers was now. Leaning back in the seat, she told Amari that, oddly enough, she felt lighter, as if all the weight of pretending, defending, and excusing had dropped from her shoulders. When he asked what she planned to do next with this new, terrifying freedom, she answered with a small, tired laugh that first she needed sleep. Then she would visit her grandmother again and make sure the doctors had everything they needed to prove what happened. After that, she would walk into her new office on Monday as the department head, determined to build a future that wasn't built on lies. The practical details, lawyers, paperwork, maybe renting a small place on her own, would come later. He reminded her that Killian would likely fight for his share of the condo, and she shrugged, saying she'd rather give up bricks and walls than keep living in a home that felt haunted by deceit. The important thing was that, with her promotion, she no longer needed his income or his approval to survive. She finally had the financial independence to choose herself. She thanked Amari for standing by her all day, for leaving work, listening to her story, driving across town twice, sitting with her at the hospital and the police station. She pointed out that, once again, the people who truly show up in a crisis are the ones who matter. He answered simply that he would always be there for her, and this time the word always felt less like polite reassurance and more like a promise rooted in experience. When she asked if she could stay at his place for a few days while she figured out her next step, he agreed immediately, warning her with a small smile about his moody cat, who considered himself the real owner of the apartment. The thought of a grumpy animal guarding the sofa made her laugh for the first time all day, the sound shaky but sincere. As the car turned off the main road and onto a quieter street, she watched the constellations of street lamps and headlights blend and blur. Her mind drifted back over her family history. The engineer great-grandfather who had built bridges and earned the West End brownstone as a reward for his work, her grandmother's difficult marriages, her mother's warnings about rushing into love. So many of the women before her had been hurt by men who saw them as stepping stones or bank accounts, yet they had also been survivors, smart and resilient. Maybe, she thought, this was her chance to finally break the pattern rather than repeat it. When Amari asked what she was thinking about, she said she was reflecting on how much had changed in just one day and how some things, like discovering who your real allies are, never change at all. She squeezed his arm in gratitude and repeated her thanks, this time without tears. Looking up at the stars barely visible above the city glow, she realized that for the first time in a long while, the future, though uncertain, didn't terrify her. It intrigued her. There would be court dates, awkward explanations, difficult conversations with her mother, and days when the betrayal would sting like a fresh wound. There would also be mornings when she'd walk into her office knowing she ran the show, visits with her grandmother where they'd share stories over tea that nobody else had tampered with, and quiet evenings where she could finally hear her own thoughts without someone else's demands drowning them out. She thought back to the silly fake firing joke that had started it all. What had begun as a small, careless prank had ripped open a hidden truth and saved her and her grandmother from a far darker outcome. Every storm cloud, as her elders liked to say, held a sliver of light along its edges. As they pulled up outside Amari's building, she stepped out with her suitcase and inhaled the cool night air. She felt bruised but unbroken, tired but strangely hopeful. This morning, she had driven to work worrying about overdue bills and distant dreams. By night, she had uncovered betrayal, protected the person who had loved her longest, ended a toxic marriage, and stepped onto an unknown but honest path. Somewhere inside, beneath the pain and shock, a quiet conviction settled in. She would be okay. She would rebuild. She might even learn, in time, to trust again, starting with herself. And somewhere, in living rooms and kitchens far from Atlanta, listeners or readers could look at her story and recognize pieces of their own. If her experience resonated, she hoped they'd stay, share where they were from, and come along for more life stories. Tales of mistakes, courage, and second chances. Because life, she thought as she followed Amari inside, doesn't end when illusions shatter. Sometimes, that's exactly when it truly begins.